Hi, I'm Erik Jones, and you're listening to Verse by Verse. There is an idea in some religions called original sin. This idea, which is believed by millions of people, is that all human beings are essentially born sinners. Usually it's explained that the sin of Adam in the Garden of Eden passed on to all his descendants. According to this view, we're born with sin by merit of nothing more than our birth. At that time, it's believed that Adam's sin is placed on our spiritual record. But not only that, we're supposedly born with Adam's stained and twisted character as well. All because, again, we inherited it from Adam. Sometimes this idea is called the fall of man. In other words, all mankind fell into sin automatically because of Adam's decision. This is why some religions practice infant baptism. The idea is that a newborn baby should be baptized as soon as possible in order to remove the stain of original sin from his or her record. Now let me pause to mention that we have two articles, one on original sin and one on infant baptism on our website that you might find very helpful. In fact, you can find links to them in the show notes. Now, these religions also believe there are sins we commit by our own decisions. They usually call these actual sins. But original sin is supposedly something we have no control over. It's something viewed like a congenital birth defect, one that everyone's born with. But we must ask, is this idea true? Is it rooted in the scriptures? Interestingly enough, our verse of focus in today's episode is one that the proponents of original sin will often cite for support. And admittedly, that can be understandable if you read it in a certain way. Let me show you what I mean. Let's read this verse, Romans 5, verse 12. Paul writes, "Therefore, just as through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin, and thus death spread to all men." Now, in the context, the one man in this verse clearly refers to Adam. Nobody disputes that. So reading it like this seems to support the idea of original sin. It's basically saying because of Adam, sin entered the world and death through sin, and because of that, death spread to all men. That can certainly sound like we're automatically born sinners because of Adam. But the problem with reading it like this is that it leaves off the final three words of the verse. And in this case, those three words at the end of this verse make a huge difference. So let's read the entire verse, including the last three words. Therefore, just as through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin, and thus death spread to all men, because all sinned. See the difference? What the verse actually says when you include the last three words is very different from the doctrine of original sin. So let's break it down. Paul starts, just as through one man sin entered the world. Well, how should we understand that? Again, this refers to the Genesis 3 account of Adam and Eve in the garden. In another New Testament verse, we read that Eve was deceived, but Adam actually disobeyed willfully. He wasn't deceived. As the leader of the family and the one who absolutely knew better, Adam bore primary responsibility for eating that forbidden fruit. Because of his decision, which again he made with full knowledge that it was wrong, sin, or disobedience to God's law, entered the human race. In other words, as Paul writes here, sin entered the world being the human realm. The verse continues, and death through sin, and thus death spread to all men. Death is the God-ordained penalty for sin. This is reinforced in Romans 6:23, where we read that the wages of sin is death. God has laws. Those laws, when obeyed, can result in incredible blessings. But that law also has penalties built in when we break it. The ultimate penalty is death. Sometimes Paul referred to this as the curse of the law. When we make the decision to sin, we bring upon ourselves, our personal record, the penalty of death. Death is what we deserve when we break God's commands. Paul says that the penalty of death has spread to all men. Every human being who has ever lived, of course with one notable exception, has brought that penalty upon themselves. But again, is it because they were born with it? Did they inherit that penalty from Adam? No. It is, as Paul wrote at the end of the verse, because all sinned. In other words, it's because we've all followed the example, the path of Adam. Like Adam, we've all made the willful choice to break God's law, and not just once, but many times throughout our lives. When we make that choice, even just once, and transgress God's commandments, we are, in a sense, following Adam's lead. We follow his path. We walk the trail he trod, the trail of sin. No, we're not born with it. God doesn't operate that way. He doesn't curse us with sin by the merit of other people's mistakes. The Bible is clear that each of us individually is responsible for the penalty of our own personal sin. As Paul wrote in Romans 3:23, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. When Adam took the forbidden fruit, he sinned and fell short of the glory of God. And when you and when I sin, however big or small that sin may be, you and I also fall short of the glory of God by our own merits. We bring the penalty on ourselves. The wages of our personal sin is death. The good news, which is also covered here in Romans 5, is that there is a way we can be released from that penalty. And there is another path we can follow. And that's, of course, through Jesus Christ. As Paul writes in Romans 5, verse 18, by one man's obedience, many will be made righteous. That man, of course, is Jesus Christ. If you keep walking the path blazed by Adam, it will lead to eternal death. But if you seek forgiveness and walk the path blazed by Jesus Christ, it will lead to blessings, happiness, and ultimately, eternal life.
Verse by Verse is a companion podcast to the Daily Bible Verse blog, which you can find on the Life, Hope, and Truth Learning Center. Check out the show notes for more.